2 weeks after we buried my mother, I found myself sitting alone in her sewing room. The rest of the family had already taken what they wanted. My sister kept her recipe books. My younger brother claimed the old radio Dad used to listen to every evening. But I couldn't bring myself to touch much of anything. The room still smelled like lavender and starch. For nearly 50 years, that little room had been my mother's world. Quilts, curtains, school uniforms. If it needed stitching, she fixed it. I ran my hand across the old Singer sewing machine she'd used since I was a boy. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the side panels seemed loose. Mom hated loose things. If a button wobbled, she'd sew it back before you could blink. Seeing something out of place bothered me enough that I bent down for a closer look. The panel shifted, and something slid out. An envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written across the front. Not Michael, not son, just my full name, carefully written in the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards my entire life. But it was the sentence beneath my name that made my chest tighten. Please forgive me before you read this. I sat down so fast I nearly missed the chair. Forgive her? My mother? The woman who spent her life taking care of everyone else? As I stared at that envelope, one thought kept circling in my mind. What could my mother possibly need forgiveness for after all these years? And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to know.
I must have held that envelope for almost an hour. Several times, I nearly put it back where I'd found it. Some things, I told myself, were better left alone. At 70 years old, I'd learned that not every question needed an answer. But those 7 words wouldn't let me rest. Asterisk, please forgive me before you read this. Asterisk, my mother wasn't a dramatic woman. She didn't speak in riddles. If she'd hidden this all these years, there had to be a reason. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper was brittle, and the date in the corner stopped me cold. April 14th, 1963. 63 years ago. I carefully unfolded it and recognized her handwriting immediately. And then I read the first line. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone home to your father, and there's something I should have told you long ago. Asterisk, I swallowed hard. My father had been gone nearly 18 years. Mom had never remarried, never even talked about another man. She'd spent every day after Dad passed tending her garden, volunteering at church, and spoiling her grandchildren. I continued reading. Asterisk, the greatest regret of my life wasn't something I did. It was something I never had the courage to tell you. Asterisk, my heart began to pound. Regret? Mom? That word didn't belong to the woman I knew. Then my eyes reached the next sentence, and I froze, because written in her careful handwriting were words I never imagined I'd read. Asterisk, before I met your father, there was someone else. Asterisk, suddenly, the quiet sewing room felt very small, and for the first time in my life, I realized I might not have known my mother at all. I read that line 3 times. Asterisk, before I met your father, there was someone else. Asterisk, my first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. My mother had loved my father deeply. Anyone who spent 5 minutes around them could see that. Even after Dad passed, she still kept his reading glasses in the top drawer of his nightstand, exactly where he'd left them. So who was this someone else? I kept reading. Asterisk, his name was Thomas Walker. And before you judge me, please know that your father knew about him. In fact, he was the one who convinced me to write this letter. Asterisk, I blinked. Dad knew. Suddenly, I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. Thomas Walker. The name meant nothing to me. No stories. No photographs. No passing comments at Thanksgiving dinners. Nothing. Yet here was my mother, reaching across 6 decades to tell me about a man I'd never heard of. The next sentence made my throat tighten. Asterisk, Thomas was my first love, Michael. And losing him broke a part of me that never fully healed. Asterisk, I sat back in the chair. My mother? Heartbroken. She'd always been the strong one. The woman who held our family together after Dad died. The woman who never complained, even when arthritis made it painful to sew. I'd never imagined she'd carried wounds she never spoke of. Then I reached the final line on the page. And suddenly, I understood why she'd hidden the letter. Asterisk, there is something I need you to do, and I pray you'll find it in your heart to do it. Asterisk, but she didn't say what it was. Instead, at the bottom of the page, she had written only 4 words. Look inside the cedar chest. And, sitting in the corner of the sewing room, was the old cedar chest nobody in the family had opened in years. I slowly turned toward the corner of the room. The cedar chest had been there for as long as I could remember. As kids, my brother and I used to sit on top of it while Mom sewed Halloween costumes or patched our blue jeans. She always told us the same thing. Asterisk, that's just old keepsakes, boys. Nothing exciting in there. Asterisk, apparently, she'd been wrong. Or maybe she'd been protecting something. The brass latch squeaked as I lifted the lid. The familiar smell of cedar drifted into the room, bringing back memories I hadn't thought about in decades. Inside were folded quilts, baby clothes, and Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper so old the ink had faded. Nothing unusual. At least, not at first. Then I noticed a small wooden box tucked beneath one of the quilts. My hand suddenly felt cold. The box wasn't large, about the size of a Bible, and resting on top of it was a photograph. I picked it up. My breath caught. The woman smiling in the picture was unmistakably my mother, but she couldn't have been older than 20. And standing beside her, with his arm around her shoulders, was a young man I'd never seen before. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were 3 words. Emily and Thomas, 1958. I stared at the picture. Mom looked happier than I'd ever seen her. Not because she hadn't been happy with Dad, but because this was the smile of someone whose whole life still lay ahead of her. Then I opened the wooden box, and right on top was another envelope. This one had only a single sentence written across the front. If you're holding this, then you've already met Thomas. I nearly dropped it, because I hadn't. At least, I didn't think I had. I sat there staring at the envelope, certain I had read it wrong. If you're holding this, then you've already met Thomas. Met him? How could I have met a man I'd never even heard of? My mother had never mentioned him. Neither had Dad. And if Thomas had been her first love, why had his name been hidden away in a cedar chest for nearly 70 years? With shaking fingers, I opened the envelope. A small object slipped into my lap. It was a ring. Simple. Silver. Worn smooth with age. Not a wedding ring. Just a plain band with the initials TW engraved inside. Beneath it was another letter. Michael, before you become upset with me, please know this. Your father was the love of my life, and I thank God every day for the years we shared. But long before I met him, Thomas gave me something I could never repay, a promise. I paused. A promise? And I spent 60 years trying to keep it. My eyes drifted back to the photograph. Mom looked so young, so hopeful. Who was this man? And why had Dad encouraged her to leave these letters behind? Then I read the next sentence. And for the first time since opening that first envelope, tears filled my eyes. Thomas saved my life, Michael. Save her life? I leaned forward. The room around me disappeared. Suddenly, I wasn't cleaning out my mother's sewing room anymore. I was sitting at the edge of a story she'd carried in silence for most of her life. And I realized something that broke my heart. Maybe my mother hadn't hidden these memories because she was ashamed. Maybe she'd hidden them because remembering them had always been too painful. And as I turned the page, I had no idea that the story was about to take me back to the summer of 1958, when a 20-year-old girl named Emily first met a young man named Thomas Walker. I was 20 years old when I met Thomas. My mother's letter began. Asterisk. And if anyone had told me then that one summer would shape the rest of my life, I would have laughed. Asterisk. I settled deeper into the chair and kept reading. It was the summer of 1958. Mom, Emily back then, had just finished secretarial school and was helping her father at the family hardware store in Ashland, Kentucky. I thought my life was already planned, she wrote. Asterisk, marry a nice boy, raise children, and never wander too far from home. Asterisk. Then one July morning, a young man walked into the store asking for paint. Thomas Walker, 23 years old, fresh out of the army, tall, polite, and carrying a smile that made my mother forget what she was supposed to say. He bought 2 cans of blue paint and accidentally left without them, she wrote. Asterisk. I ran halfway down Main Street to catch him. He laughed and said he'd spent so much time looking at me that he'd forgotten why he'd come in. Asterisk. I smiled despite myself. It sounded exactly like something Mom would blush telling her friends, but never her children. They started slowly. Church picnics, ice cream after work, Saturday evenings at the drive-in theater. Thomas wasn't rich, she wrote. Asterisk, but he was kind, and kindness lasts longer than money. Asterisk, I stopped reading for a moment. Those words sounded so much like her. Then my eyes found the next paragraph, and the smile faded from my face. Asterisk, by Christmas, we had plans to marry, but God had other plans for us. Asterisk, I swallowed hard, because even before I read another word, I could feel heartbreak waiting just ahead. I took a deep breath and continued reading. The winter of 1958 was colder than anything I'd ever known, Mom wrote. Asterisk, and by Christmas, Thomas and I were making plans no one could talk us out of. Asterisk, they had already chosen a date. June of the following year. Nothing fancy, just a small church wedding and a modest house Thomas had been fixing up himself. He painted the kitchen yellow because I once told him sunshine made me happy, she wrote. I smiled. That sounded like a man deeply in love. Then came January, and with it, the worst blizzard Eastern Kentucky had seen in years. Asterisk, your grandfather became stranded at the hardware store while trying to secure the building. By nightfall, no one could reach him. Asterisk, Mom wanted to go after her father. Everyone told her it was too dangerous. Everyone except Thomas. Asterisk, he didn't hesitate, Michael. He grabbed his coat and said, no father should spend the night alone in that storm. Asterisk, together they set out. But halfway there, disaster struck. Their truck slid off the road and into a ditch. I remember the sound of metal bending and the bitter cold rushing in, she wrote. Asterisk, I remember being afraid. Asterisk, and then came the sentence that made my chest tighten. Asterisk, what happened next is something I never spoke about. Not because I forgot, but because I never stopped remembering. Asterisk, I leaned closer. Asterisk, Thomas got me out first. Asterisk, asterisk, he wrapped me in his coat and carried me through snow nearly up to his waist. Asterisk, asterisk, and when I begged him not to leave me, he smiled and promised me he'd be right back after finding help. Asterisk, I stopped breathing when I reached the next line, because the handwriting itself seemed shakier. Asterisk, that was the last time I ever saw him alive. Asterisk, I read that line again. Asterisk, that was the last time I ever saw him alive. Asterisk, the room felt colder than before. Even though I was sitting in my mother's sewing room, wrapped in decades of warmth and memories, something in me shifted. The story was no longer just history. It felt personal, heavy, unfinished. I continued reading. Asterisk, the storm didn't just trap us, Michael. It erased everything familiar. Asterisk, she described how Thomas had insisted on going for help while she stayed behind, sheltered under the overturned truck. The wind was so loud, she could barely hear him speak. He kept brushing snow off my hair like it mattered more than the freezing cold, she wrote. Asterisk, and he kept repeating the same thing. I'll be right back. Don't you dare close your eyes. Asterisk, but she did close her eyes, not from sleep, from exhaustion. When she woke, the world had gone silent. Thomas was gone. No footprints leading back. No sign of him returning. Only snow. Endless, blank snow. I waited until my body stopped feeling like my own, she wrote. Asterisk, and when rescue finally came 2 days later, I asked the same question over and over again. Asterisk, I leaned in closer. Asterisk, where is Thomas Walker? Asterisk, the answer came from a rescue worker, not from Thomas himself. He had gone out into a storm no one should have survived. But he never made it to the highway. They searched for days, then weeks. Then they stopped. The snow melted. Spring came, and Thomas Walker was never found. I sat back slowly. My hand was shaking now, because I realized something that my mother had buried deep inside. That cedar chest wasn't just a love story. It was grief, the kind that never gets a grave. And then I turned the page and saw a single line at the top. Asterisk, but that is not the end of Thomas's story. Asterisk, I froze at that line. Asterisk, but that is not the end of Thomas's story. Asterisk, my mind refused to accept it. Not because I didn't believe my mother, But because I didn't understand how a story could continue after what she had just written, I kept reading. Everyone believed Thomas was gone, she wrote. Asterisk. Even I tried to believe it, because believing it was the only way to survive. Asterisk. Weeks passed after the storm. Then months. Life slowly tried to return to normal. But for Emily, nothing felt normal anymore. She stopped going to the hardware store, stopped seeing friends, stopped talking about the future she had once planned so easily. Then one evening in late spring, there was a knock at her door. I remember thinking it was impossible, she wrote. Asterisk, because I'd already buried him in my heart. Asterisk, I leaned closer without realizing it. When I opened the door, I didn't see a ghost, she continued. Asterisk, I saw a man who looked like he had walked out of another life. Asterisk, Thomas Walker, alive, barely, thin, scarred, exhausted, but standing. I stopped breathing. He was leaning on a wooden cane he had carved himself, she wrote. Asterisk, and when he saw me, he dropped it. Asterisk, the letter paused there for a moment, as if even her memory needed time to catch up. Then she continued. Asterisk, the first thing he said wasn't my name. Asterisk, asterisk, it was, I promised I would come back. Asterisk, I felt my throat tighten, because I could almost hear it. The weight of survival, the disbelief of return. But something about it didn't make sense. If Thomas had survived, why did the world believe he was dead? And why had my mother spent the rest of her life carrying a secret like this? I turned the page slowly and found only one sentence written at the top. Asterisk, what I am about to tell you is the part one have never told another soul. Asterisk, I stared at that line for a moment longer than I should have. Asterisk, what I am about to tell you is the part one have never told another soul. Asterisk, even after everything I had read, something about those words felt different, heavier, like the story had been holding its breath up until now. I continued reading. Asterisk, when Thomas came back to me, he was not the same man who left in the snow. Asterisk, he told her what happened after he left her in the storm, how he fought through whiteout conditions for hours, following what he believed was the road, how he collapsed more than once, how he should have died where he fell. But he didn't. He said he woke up in a barn, she wrote. Asterisk, not knowing how he got there. Asterisk, a farmer had found him nearly frozen and carried him inside. No name was given at first. No report filed immediately. Just warmth, recovery, silence. Weeks passed before anyone in town even knew he was alive. But by then, something else had already happened. The world had already buried him, Mom wrote. And that changed everything. I paused, because I could almost see it now. A man returning to a life that no longer existed for him. She continued. Thomas didn't come back to celebrations. There were no reunions, no joy in the town square. Instead, there was confusion and distance. People had mourned him. His belongings were gone. Even his job had been filled. And worse, asterisk, someone had already told your father that I was alone. Asterisk, my hand tightened around the paper. My father? This was the first time his name entered the story in a way that felt sharp. Your father came to see me weeks after Thomas disappeared, she wrote. Asterisk, he didn't come to take anything from me. He came to make sure I was okay. Asterisk, I swallowed. Asterisk, and when Thomas finally returned, he didn't come back to a life waiting for him. Asterisk, asterisk, he came back to a life that had already moved forward without him. Asterisk, the page ended there. And for the first time since I started reading, I felt something shift in the story. Not betrayal, not romance, something more complicated. Loss that had no villain, only timing and silence. I turned the page slowly and saw just one sentence written at the top. Asterisk, this is the choice that changed all three of our lives. Asterisk, I read that sentence twice. Asterisk, this is the choice that changed all three of our lives. Asterisk, my throat felt tight before I even continued. The handwriting on the page looked different here, slightly uneven, like my mother had written it while trying to hold back something she'd carried for too long. When Thomas returned, she wrote, asterisk, I was already standing in a different life. Asterisk, she explained that in the months after the storm, people assumed Thomas was gone for good. In a small town, assumptions quickly become truth. Doors closed quietly. Names stopped being mentioned. And life, as it always does, kept moving. Then came my father. Your father didn't pressure me, she wrote. Asterisk, he simply stayed. Asterisk, he checked on her family. Helped repair the hardware store after the storm damage. Walked her home from church when winter nights got too dark. Not with grand gestures, but with presence. And presence, she admitted, slowly became comfort. I didn't stop loving Thomas, she wrote. Asterisk, I just stopped believing he would come back. Asterisk, I stopped reading for a moment. That line didn't feel like confession. It felt like exhaustion. Then she continued. The day Thomas returned, he came to her house first. He stood on the porch alive, breathing real. And for a moment, everything else disappeared. I ran to him, she wrote. Asterisk, I didn't think. I didn't choose. I just ran. Asterisk. But behind him, down the road, my father was standing. Watching. Waiting. Not angry. Just still. That was the moment everything broke into 3 pieces. Thomas believed I was still his future, she wrote. Asterisk. Your father believed I was already his present. Asterisk. And she believed she had no right to hurt either of them. I felt my chest tighten, because there was no villain here. No betrayal in the way stories usually paint it. Only timing, and a woman standing between 2 versions of her life. Then came the final line on the page. Asterisk, so I made a decision that I have carried every day since. Asterisk, I held the paper a little tighter. Something in me didn't want to turn the page. Not because I was losing interest, but because I could feel what was coming. My mother had been building toward a moment she had carried for 60 years. I continued reading. I asked both of them to meet me at the church the next morning, she wrote. Asterisk, because I knew I couldn't face that choice twice. Asterisk, that night, she didn't sleep. Thomas stayed at the small boarding house on the edge of town. My father stayed at his sister's home across the river. Neither of them knew what the other would hear the next day. But she did. I prayed more that night than I had in my entire life, she wrote. Asterisk, not for an answer, but for courage. Asterisk, the next morning, the church was quiet. No ceremony, no crowd. Just 3 people standing in a place where promises were supposed to be made, not broken. Thomas stood on one side of the aisle, my father on the other, and my mother in between. I remember thinking that no matter what I chose, I would lose something I could never replace, she wrote. Then came the sentence that made my stomach sink. Asterisk, so I chose the one who stayed. Asterisk, I stopped breathing. She explained it wasn't about love fading. It wasn't about Thomas being less. It was about something simpler and heavier. Life, time, reality. Thomas had been gone long enough that the world had already rewritten itself. And my father had been there while she was trying to survive the silence. Thomas didn't shout, she wrote. Asterisk, he didn't beg. He just looked at me like he already knew. Asterisk. Then he turned around and walked out of the church, and never came back into her life again. I sat back slowly. The sewing room felt different now. Not empty, but full of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or history that had never been allowed to speak. Then I turned the page, and saw a final line at the top. Asterisk, before you decide what to feel about me, there is one last thing you must know. Asterisk. I stared at the line for a long time. Asterisk, before you decide what to feel about me, there is one last thing you must know. Asterisk. My hand hovered over the page. For the first time, I wasn't just reading a story about my mother. I felt like I was being asked to judge a life I had never fully seen. I continued. Asterisk. I did not choose your father because Thomas was unworthy. Asterisk. Asterisk. And I did not leave Thomas because I stopped loving him. Asterisk. That stopped me, because it removed every simple explanation I had been building in my mind. She went on. Asterisk. I left because I was afraid of what love demands when life does not cooperate. Asterisk. She described it in a way I had never heard anyone describe love before. Not as a feeling, but as a burden of timing, distance, and consequence. When Thomas came back, she wrote, asterisk, he brought back the life I had stopped imagining. Asterisk. But she had already begun building another one. With my father. With stability. with something that didn't disappear in a storm. I was not brave enough to destroy one life to restore another, she admitted. My throat tightened. There was no villain in her words, only hesitation that lasted too long. Then came the final paragraph of the letter. Asterisk. I married your father because he was the life that stayed when everything else did not. Asterisk. Asterisk. And I love him fully, deeply, and honestly. Asterisk. Asterisk. But I never stopped wondering what Thomas became after he walked out of that church. Asterisk. The letter ended there. No dramatic forward. No finale paligi. Just silence. I lowered the paper slowly. Outside the sewing room window, the afternoon light had shifted without me noticing. For a long time, I just sat there, because I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't a story about betrayal. It wasn't even a story about loss. It was a story about decisions that don't have clean endings, and love that doesn't fit into one lifetime. My eyes drifted back to the cedar chest. Inside it, there was still the photograph, still the ring, and still a name I had never spoken aloud before meeting that letter. Thomas Walker. But now, he wasn't just a name anymore. He was unfinished history. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew this wasn't the end of it. Because my mother hadn't hidden this story just to be remembered. She had left it because she wanted something from me. Something I hadn't discovered yet. I was about to find out what that was. I thought the letter was the end of it. But my mother had never been a woman who left things incomplete. The next morning, I went back into the sewing room. The house was quieter than usual. Empty in that way grief makes everything feel stretched and unfamiliar. I sat beside the cedar chest again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the photograph of my mother and Thomas. Young, smiling, unaware of everything that would come after. I turned it over again. Asterisk, Emily and Thomas, 1958. Asterisk. But this time, I noticed something I had missed before. A faint second line in the corner. Barely visible unless you tilted it toward the light. An address. Mill Creek Road, Cabin 7. I frowned. That wasn't a place I recognized. And my mother had never lived anywhere called Mill Creek Road. So why write it down? And why hide it? I placed the photograph back into the box, but my attention shifted to the ring. I held it between my fingers again. The initials T.W. felt heavier than metal alone should feel. That was when I noticed something else, scratched faintly along the inside edge. Not just initials this time, but a second marking, a symbol, a small carved shape I couldn't quite place. It looked almost like a compass, but not quite. I sat there trying to understand what my mother had left behind. A story, a ring, a photograph, and now a location. It wasn't random. It was intentional. She hadn't just told me about Thomas. She had left a trail. And for the first time since opening that envelope, a thought formed in my mind that made my stomach tighten. What if Thomas wasn't just part of the past? What if something connected to him was still out there, waiting? I looked at the address again. Mill Creek Road, Cabin 7. And I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I was going to find it. Mill Creek Road kept repeating in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter, the photograph, the ring, all of it felt like pieces of something I was finally being pushed to complete. By morning, I had packed a small bag. Not because I was sure, but because I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before leaving, I checked the cedar chest one more time. There was nothing new inside, except a folded note I hadn't noticed before, tucked under the lining. Only one sentence. If you follow this, you are choosing to understand him, not judge me. No signature, but I didn't need one. It was her. My mother was still guiding me, even after death. I placed the note back and closed the chest slowly. For a moment, I just stood there, a 70-year-old man about to chase a story that started long before he was born. Then I whispered something I didn't expect myself to say. All right, I'm going. And I left the house. Mill Creek Road wasn't easy to find. At least, not at first. The GPS didn't recognize it. The map apps kept rerouting me to dead ends and empty stretches of highway that led nowhere meaningful. It was only after I stopped at a small gas station outside Ashland that I got my first real answer. The attendant was older, maybe in his late 60s. When I mentioned Mill Creek Road, he paused. A long pause. Then he said something that stuck with me. Haven't heard that name in years. He leaned closer. That road's been half forgotten, but Cabin 7? People used to say nobody really lived there for long. I asked why. He just shrugged. Some folks say it was a place people went when they didn't want to be found. I felt that line more than I understood it. Before I left, he added one more thing. If you're looking for answers, don't expect them to be simple. And for the first time since this began, I realized something unsettling. My mother hadn't just left me a memory. She had left me a place that people avoided. And somewhere ahead was Cabin 7. The road to Mill Creek grew narrower the deeper I went. Paved streets gave way to cracked asphalt, then gravel, then nothing that felt maintained at all. Trees leaned in close on both sides, like they were watching me drive through something I wasn't supposed to enter. When I finally saw the sign for Mill Creek Road, it was half-rotted wood, barely readable, and beneath it, faded paint. Cabin 7. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The air felt different here. Heavier, like even sound didn't travel the same way. I followed the dirt path until the trees opened slightly. And there it was. A small cabin. Weathered wood. Slanted roof. A porch that looked like it hadn't supported weight in years. But was standing. That was enough to make my chest tighten. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, engine still running. This was the first real connection to Thomas Walker outside a photograph and a letter. I stepped out. The ground creaked under my shoes as I walked closer. No signs of life. No movement. Just silence. Then I noticed something strange. The front door wasn't locked. Not broken. Not forced. Just slightly open. Like someone had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. I reached for the handle and paused. For the first time since this began, I felt a clear question rise in my mind. If I opened this door, would I finally understand my mother? Or would I step into a story she had spent her entire life trying to survive? I pushed the door open slowly. It didn't creak like I expected. It almost sighed, like the cabin had been holding its breath for years and finally let it go. Inside, the air was still. Dust hung in the sunlight, cutting through broken window blinds. Everything looked untouched, but not abandoned in the usual sense. It felt more like someone had stepped out and simply never been allowed to return. A small table sat near the center of the room. On it, a lantern, a worn notebook, and a wooden box. My heart started beating harder. I walked closer, each step louder than the last. The notebook was the first thing I picked up. The cover had a name written in faded ink. T. Walker. My breath caught. Thomas. I opened it. The first page wasn't a diary entry. It was a list. Dates. Short notes. Weather conditions. Simple words like asterisk, alive, walking, search failed, heard voices. Asterisk, confusion mixed with something heavier in my chest. This wasn't just memory. It was survival. Then I turned another page and saw a sentence that stopped me cold. Asterisk, if anyone finds this, I did not disappear by accident. Asterisk, I looked up instinctively, as if expecting someone to be standing in the room. Nothing. Just silence. I set the notebook down and reached for the wooden box. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were items carefully wrapped. A compass, a worn army tag, and a folded piece of cloth that looked like it had been part of a uniform. But beneath everything was another envelope, different from the others. No apology this time. No explanation. Just my mother's handwriting. And one line. Now you're close enough to know what I could never say out loud. My hands didn't open the envelope right away. Something about it felt final in a way the others hadn't. The earlier letters were explanations. This one felt like a doorway I couldn't close after stepping through. I finally tore it open. Inside was only one page. No dates. No long story. Just a confession written in a steadier hand than I expected. Asterisk, Thomas did not return the way I told you. Asterisk, I froze. She continued. Asterisk, he was found by men who were not part of any rescue team. Asterisk, my eyes narrowed. That didn't match anything I had read before. Asterisk, they were traveling through Mill Creek that winter, searching for something else entirely. Thomas was not supposed to survive long enough to speak. Asterisk, my chest tightened. Asterisk, but he did. Asterisk, the letter went on. She wrote that Thomas had been taken to the cabin, not as shelter, but as hiding. Not by accident, but by choice of someone else. And then the line, that made my stomach drop. Asterisk, when he finally returned to town, he was not just a survivor, he was a witness. Asterisk, I looked up again at the room. The silence suddenly felt different. Not empty. Hidden. I turned back to the letter. Asterisk, the reason I could not speak of this is simple, Michael. Asterisk, because what Thomas saw that winter was never meant to be remembered. Asterisk, my mouth went dry. She ended it with one instruction. Asterisk, if you want the truth about him, do not stay in the cabin. Asterisk, follow the ridge behind it. Asterisk, I lowered the page slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees harder now, brushing against the cabin walls like something trying to be heard. I looked toward the back door. The ridge. My mother hadn't just led me here. She had pointed me further. And whatever Thomas Walker had carried out of that winter was still waiting beyond this cabin. I folded the letter and held it for a moment longer than I should have. Something about it felt heavier than paper. Like once I accepted it, I couldn't go back to simply finding answers anymore. I stepped out of the cabin through the back door. The air hit differently here, colder, sharper. The land sloped upward into a ridge covered in uneven rock and dense trees. No clear path, just direction. I started walking. At first, it felt like any hike, branches brushing my arms, gravel shifting under my shoes. But the higher I climbed, the more the silence changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt watchful. After nearly 20 minutes, I saw something unnatural among the trees. A post, old, weathered wood, and tied to it, faded fabric. A marker. My breath slowed. I moved closer. Carved into the wood was a name. Not fully visible at first, but once I cleared the moss with my hand, I saw it clearly. T. Walker. Beneath it, another marking. Not a grave date. Just one word. Returned. My stomach tightened. Returned from what? I stepped back, scanning the ridge. And that's when I noticed something lower down the slope. A second marker. Then a third. They weren't random. They formed a line. A pattern. Someone had mapped something here. Not a burial ground. A route. And at the very end of that line, something metallic caught the fading light. Half buried in the earth. I walked toward it slowly, my heart beating louder with every step. And when I finally reached it, I knelt down and brushed away the dirt. It was a military tag, Rüstvorn, but still readable. And engraved on it was a phrase that made my breath stop completely. Project Mill Creek, Witness 1. I stared at the tag for a long time. Project Mill Creek, Witness 1. The words didn't belong in the story I had been reading all my life. This wasn't a love story anymore. It wasn't even just loss. It was something hidden under it. I kept digging lightly with my fingers around the spot, half expecting nothing else to be there. But there was more. A second metal piece. A smaller tag, older, scratched deeper. It had only coordinates and a stamp date from 1959. I felt my chest tighten. That was the year after the storm, which meant whatever happened here didn't end when Thomas was found. It continued. My mother's voice echoed in my mind through her letters. He came back as a witness. Now it made sense, but in a way that made everything worse. Thomas hadn't just survived a storm. He had seen something organized, something that didn't want to be known. And the cabin, the ridge, the markers. This wasn't random survival. It was containment. I stood slowly, looking back toward the cabin below. And for the first time, I understood why my mother never spoke openly about him. Not because she forgot him, but because remembering him meant remembering what he saw. And that was something she spent her entire life protecting me from. The wind moved through the ridge again, but now it didn't feel like nature. It felt like distance, like something unfinished waiting to be acknowledged. And I knew I couldn't stop here, because whatever Project Mill Creek was, Thomas hadn't been the only one affected by it. He had been the first one to survive it. I returned to the cabin just before sunset. My hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore, from understanding too much at once. Inside, I went straight back to the wooden box. At the very bottom, beneath everything, was one final envelope I hadn't seen before. Smaller, thinner, no date, just my name again. I opened it. Only 3 lines inside. Michael, I did not hide Thomas from you to protect myself. I hid him to protect you from what follows people who speak his name. My throat tightened. If you have reached the ridge, then you already know he was never just lost. I looked up slowly, the weight of those words settling into me. The letter ended with, "Now leave this place. Do not look for more answers here." Some truths are not meant to be completed, only understood enough to stop them from continuing. I folded the letter carefully. For a long moment, I just sat in the cabin, not because I was lost, but because I finally understood the shape of the story. My mother hadn't left me a mystery to solve. She had left me a boundary. Thomas Walker wasn't a secret to uncover. He was a warning wrapped in a memory she never stopped carrying. Outside, the wind passed through the trees one last time. And for the first time since this began, I chose not to follow it.